So today we want to talk about Icelandic pagans past and present. Iceland has an extraordinary history for such a small island, only 332,000 inhabitants. They have been the source of most of what we know about Norse mythology, about pagan history. For some reason, Iceland is where a lot of that stuff is focused, despite the fact that it is a very small island and relatively recently inhabited. Iceland was one of the last major islands in the world that was not inhabited by people. When they finally settled there, there's now archaeological evidence that the earliest settlers in Iceland were almost certainly monks. They were what are called Hiberno-Scottish monks. In other words, those Irish monks that I've mentioned a couple of times, that after they were converted by Patrick to Christianity, by St. Patrick, they began to spread out and share the Christian faith, planting monasteries and various other churches, various other missions around all of Europe. Well, there is archaeological evidence that prior to the 870s, there were a group of these Irish and Scottish monks who had lived on Iceland. They have found, there are records of them having been there, people writing later on, but they also have found various kinds of books, bells, croziers, things of that sort that indicate that they were there. But very early on, sometime around 874, the Norse started showing up, and they were pagans. Either the monks left right before the pagans showed up, or the pagans showed up and the monks decided they didn't feel welcome there anymore and they decided to leave. We don't know exactly which it was, but they were almost sequential. First we had these Irish and Scottish monks who were on Iceland. They left sometime right around 870, and they usually identify 874 as the date of the first permanent settling of anyone into Iceland. We actually had several people who got to Iceland accidentally. They were trying to get somewhere else, the Norse and Swedish Vikings, and ended up being blown to Iceland and were really surprised. One of the earliest settlers that came back to Norway and recorded his finding, he landed in Iceland in the wintertime. You know, why you'd be sailing in an open ship in that part of the world in the wintertime, I don't know, but he was. He landed on Iceland and everything was frozen over. Well, he couldn't get back home at that time, and so he sort of hunkered down and lived through the winter, and he was astonished when springtime arrived and everything, the snow started melting and everything started turning green. And he was the first one that came back to Norway and said, you can live there. You know, as long as you're ready for the harsh winters, springtime, summertime are very nice. And so they ended up sometime around the 890s beginning to get the first of the permanent residents in the area of Iceland. Reykjavik, it's believed that Reykjavik is the first place that people landed and settled, and so the largest city, the capital city of Iceland, is also the site of the earliest of the people who settled on the island. And of course, the early Scandinavians, if we set aside the early monks, which we have evidence for, but nothing conclusive, the earliest of the settlers were Scandinavian pagans. They were Norse pagans. And the word pagan and the word heathen, as I'm using it here, are not meant to be pejorative. They're not meant to be negative. It's not a criticism. Modern pagans call themselves either neo-pagans or heathens. German heathenry is a modern religious movement, and so I'm not being critical when I use those words. I had somebody ask me that on a previous cruise. Was that intended to be a negative comment, a pejorative word? It's not. That's what they call themselves. So the early Norse pagans were the ones that followed the beliefs that I talked about in an earlier lecture. They worshiped the Norse gods, primarily Odin, who is represented here on the left, who is the one-eyed all-father of gods. He is the leader of all of the gods of Asgard. His son Thor, who is the protector of humanity, he was always a favorite because he's the one that protects humanity. He also represented probably most purely what the Viking kind of ethos was. He's a warrior. He's always ready to go to battle. He's exactly what the Vikings wished to be. And so Thor, especially once the Norse pagan religion began to be challenged by Christianity, he's one that they turned to a great deal. And then I just threw in for interest the goddess of the underworld, Hel. And as I told you the other day in the talk, the expression go to hell is a pre-Christian expression. hell would have been spelled with one L. And what it meant is, I hope that you have an unworthy death and that you meet the goddess of the underworld. So that's where the expression go to hell comes from. Here I am, a Christian pastor, sitting up here telling you all, go to hell. But that's where we get that, okay? Now the Scandinavians began settling, as I say, right at the end of the 9th century and into the 10th century. The Norse pagans did not have any priests. It was the chieftains that were responsible for maintaining the religious services, the sacrifices. And again, Odin, the god of wisdom, war, magic, poetry, was the leader. Thor, the protector of humankind. Some of the other gods that they worshipped were Tyr, the god of war and oaths. Frigg, the wise wife of Odin. Balder, the beautiful one, the radiant son of Odin, who is killed by Loki, the mischievous trickster. Others, Aegir and Ran, the god and goddess of the sea. Freya, the goddess of fertility, love. I talked about some of those. If you missed that lecture, then in August you can go on and hear the lecture about myths and legends of the North. These are all the kinds of deities that these early Norse pagans who settled in Iceland worship. Now, again, Iceland was the place that most of the legends were recorded. A lot of the legends of the Norse gods had come down in an oral form, but it wasn't until in Scandinavia, the 7th and 8th century, and then more particularly in Iceland in the 9th century, they began recording these things. And the primary record we have of the Norse mythology is actually from the 12th century. That's when they compiled what were called the Poetic Eddas, the poems about the gods and the heroes and the conflicts that they had, the giants versus the gods of Asgard, and all of these other stories. And also a very important book called the Prose Edda, written by Snorri Sturluson. Snorri Sturluson, the name you need to remember. In fact, I didn't even mention when I talked about the Land of Fire and Ice, the first record we have of anybody using geothermal power to heat something. Snorri Sturluson, the same guy, heated his swimming pool with it in the 12th century. He basically created a basalt stone pool and tapped into a hot spring in order to provide warm water in his pool. And so he's considered like the forerunner and hero of the use of geothermal energy to heat things. So that guy got around. You know, you really need to know about Snorri Sturluson. And so he's the one that wrote the Poetic Edda. We also have quite literally thousands of sagas from Scandinavia. Again, many of them were gathered in Iceland. Iceland technically is considered part of Scandinavia, but when I say it that way, I mean Norway, Denmark, Sweden, as opposed to Iceland. Lots of family sagas came out of Iceland at this time, which basically were stories of the families, the feuds, the various political maneuverings that occurred amongst the early Scandinavian settlers in Iceland, particularly right at the end of the 9th century and into the 10th century. And all of this was recorded in the 12th century by our good friend Snorri and others. Somebody has suggested, I think Steve commented on this, somebody suggested he would have made a good eighth dwarf, right? We've got Doc and Snorri. It sounds like an elf. The worship of the pagans at this time, they would have had statues of the various deities. I'll show you an example of that in a minute. They would have offered sacrifice, including the sacrifice of horses, other kinds of animals, and of people. Humans were sacrificed to the ancient Norse gods. They usually would have their sacrifices. They did build temples, and the Asatru, the modern pagans, are just in the process of finishing the first temple in over 1,000 years that has been built to the Norse gods. But most of their services would have been held out of doors in the open air. Right around the year 1000, there was a struggle between the various religions. They almost had a civil war in Iceland because Christianity was becoming the dominant religion throughout Europe and Scandinavia. And a lot of people were beginning to come over from Scandinavia who had converted to this relatively new faith. I mean, by 1000, it had been around for a millennium, but still it was new to the Icelanders. They were still worshiping the pagan Norse gods. So these Christians started coming over, and there was a huge conflict, and there was a threat of civil war. Well, the Althing, which is the very old parliament of Iceland, they have one of the three. They used to say have the oldest governmental body in the world. Now they say the Isle of Man might. There's like three competitors for this, but certainly it's one of the oldest ruling bodies of government in the world. Well, the Althing realized that they were at the point of civil war, so they asked one of the local chieftains, whose name was Thorgir Lasvitningagode. Lasvitningagode. You're going to have to learn to say these things. You're going to be in Reykjavik tomorrow. So Thorgir Lasvitningagode was asked to decide what religion are we going to have. And he considered the options, and he said, okay, we all need to become Christians. So they did. Back in those days, when a leader, a chieftain, a lord, whatever, when they decided that they were going to assume another religion, everybody went along. So the parliament, with the advice of Thorgir, said, we're going to become Christian. And so they did, right around the year 1000. Now, there was still some struggles and scuffles about that, but for the most part, people went along with it. And at that point, Christianity in Denmark was what we know of as Roman Catholic, because that's all existed in 1000. There weren't a division of churches. They ran into another problem, though, about 500 years later in the 16th century, the 1500s, when Christian III, who was the king of Denmark and Norway and had authority at that point. Iceland had sort of switched hands a couple of times, but it technically was under the authority of Christian III, the king of Denmark and Norway. He became a Lutheran. The 1500s was the time of the Protestant Reformation, and two very talented theologians and salespeople had studied with Martin Luther. They were Norwegian. They went back to Norway. They convinced Christian III to become Lutheran, and so he sent word to Iceland, you all have to become Lutheran. Because remember, when the leader decided this is the religion we're going to follow, everybody went along. Well, in Iceland, they weren't happy about that because they had become very committed to Catholic Christianity. And they actually had a minor war. A couple of the major Catholic bishops at that time decided they would rather fight than change to Protestantism. And so they had a minor war. One of them ended up having to leave Iceland. And eventually the John, he was called, who was the bishop, the Catholic bishop who continued to fight, he was defeated in battle, arrested, and he and two of his sons were beheaded. They took their Lutheranism very seriously, okay? And so they switched over to Lutheranism. Catholicism was actually outlawed at that point, and in fact all other religions were outlawed, but particularly Catholicism was outlawed. All the priests that had been in Iceland were forced to leave, and they continued to be without Catholicism represented in Iceland until the 1800s. The interesting thing was that the Lutheran version, the version of Lutheranism in Iceland looked very Catholic. They still used Latin until the 17th century. They lasted longer with some of the Catholic-looking kinds of things, like the use of Latin, than a lot of the other churches in Europe did. But then in 1874, Iceland voted that all religions were now to be allowed. There was complete religious freedom. At that point, the Catholics came back to Iceland and began to provide Catholic missions and evangelize. Today, there are just under 12,000 Roman Catholics in Iceland, but it is by far Lutheranism that is the dominant religion there. In fact, right now, there is an official Church of Iceland. The Church of Iceland is the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Iceland, and 69.9% of the people of Iceland are members of the Church of Iceland. Another 4.8% belong to other kinds of Lutheran churches, 3.8% Catholic, 2% other Christian, and 1.07% Asatru, which I'm going to tell you what that is in just a minute. So, interestingly though, like most of the Nordic countries, even though people have membership, and everyone in Iceland who's over age 16 has to pay a church tax to support the Church of Iceland. And in doing so, if you are a registered church in Iceland, then the government will support you, not just the Lutheran Church. The government will give land for you to build a church on if you are licensed as a church, and that means you have to have a minimum number of members. And they also will pay for the ministers. They pay the salary and support for the ministers of all of the different churches that are registered in Iceland. So this is their version of religious equality, is they support all of the different churches. But like most of Scandinavia, even though they're members of the church, most Icelanders don't attend church. It's said that only about 10% of the people, even though the majority of them are members of a church, do not actually attend. Now, for all of that expansive religious history and everything else, it is also true that a significant number of Icelanders believe in elves. In Iceland and Faroe Islands, there's a belief in the Huldufolk. They're called Huldufolk, which means the hidden people. What we know of as elves. It's believed that they live in mounds and rocks. And in fact, in Iceland, it is not uncommon for building projects to have to revise their building plans so that they don't disturb rocky areas, which are believed to be where the Huldufolk live. This chart tells you 37% of Icelanders believe it's possible that elves exist, 17% believe it's likely, 8% believe that it is definitely true, and 5% aren't sure. So the majority of people either believe in elves or believe in a possibility of elves or are not willing to take a stand on it. So they're a very spiritually oriented people. Okay, I guess just the elves, the Huldufolk, is one of the beliefs that they still maintain. And by the way, in case you're in Iceland and you're wondering if you meet a Huldufolk, they're supposed to be large in build, their clothes are all gray, and their hair is black. They don't like crosses, churches, or electricity. So that's how you can identify an elf if you are in Iceland. But I mentioned that just over 1% of the people belong to a religion called Asatru. Asatru, and the full name is Asatru Arfelgigi. Asatru Arfelgigi. It means the fellowship of those who trust the ancient gods, or the old gods. They go by Asatru as shorthand for that. In the 1970s, there was a movement in 3 different places and completely uncoordinated. In fact, each of these places didn't know the others were doing this. But in the United States in the 1970s, in Britain and in Iceland, more in Iceland than anywhere else, a group of people started to get together and they decided that they believed the ancient traditions of the Norse gods would actually be beneficial to modern people. For the most part, what they were saying is the values that they thought the Norse gods represented. And so in those 3 locations, completely independently, they began to develop various associations or groups that at least nominally worship the ancient Norse gods. In the United States, there was a group called the Viking Brotherhood that later changed their name once they found out about Iceland to the Asatru Folk Alliance. In Britain, there's a group called the Restoration of the Odinic Rite, named after Odin, the Allfather, the first of the Norse gods. And then, of course, Asatru in Iceland. You'll notice the symbol. This is a symbol of the hammer of Thor, and this is actually a pendant. In the days in which there was a competition between Christianity and the old religions, or the worship of the old gods, as they called them, it was very common for people who worshiped Thor or believed in the old gods to wear this as a pendant. And that was the way they would mark themselves, as opposed to wearing a cross, which the Christians would do. I've mentioned a couple of times, I think, the series of books by Bernard Cornwell, the Saxon Chronicles. And in that, they very clearly distinguish that the Danes, the ones who come from the Vikings, will wear hammers of Thor, and the Christian Saxons will wear crosses. And so whenever they're trying to fool somebody into thinking that they're on the other side, they have to make sure they hide their Thor's hammer or their cross, because they wore these. This is a small statue of Thor, and you'll notice it looks like he's holding an upside-down cross. You'll see that symbol, and it looks like an upside-down cross, but it really represents the hammer of Thor. This is one of the symbols for Asatru, and here we have this fellow is the high priest of Asatru right now. He is the primary leader of the organization. He was a poet and farmer, and this is one of the ritual parades. I don't know what you would call it. It's a procession in which they were traveling out to do one of the rituals. I'll talk about it in just a moment. So there was a serious movement, especially in Iceland, even more so than Britain and the US, to begin to look back to the old gods, to practice the ancient pre-Christian religious beliefs and the pre-Christian religious practices. Now, they are a little bit selective in terms of which of those they want to follow. And it's primarily the Scandinavian Norse beliefs, but they also look some to the Germanic. You know, the Wagnerian operas are based upon some of the Norse legends and myths, but there were some stories that were unique to the Germanic peoples and not as much Norse. There's also an English tradition of this, the Anglo-Saxons. I spoke to someone the other day about the poem Beowulf. Beowulf is an Anglo-Saxon poem. It was written in Old English, but it's about a Scandinavian warrior. So there is some of that tradition that came out of the Anglo-Saxons in England as well. But this group, Asatru, that worships the old gods, they will refer to themselves as being part of Nordic paganism or even of heathenry. That sounds like such a bad word to us, or a negative thing, heathenry, but that's how they often will refer to themselves. Now, they're very particular in terms of what parts of it they want to assume. They do not practice sacrifice, either of people or animals. They don't believe in this sort of rampant violence, which the Vikings and a lot of the ancient Norse would have maintained, and they don't accept slavery. In fact, they're very particular about this. There's been sort of two schools of this pagan belief. You may remember, if you know anything about the history of the Second World War, that the Nazis were very involved in Nordic religion. Wagnerian operas were a favorite of the Nazis, of Adolf Hitler and others, partly because the Norse myths that are represented there, you know, the Valkyrie, the Ring of the Nibelung, etc. Well, there was a time, and the Nazis sort of intensified this, where belief in the pagan gods, the Norse gods, became racist because it was focused on Northern European people of Northern European descent, and if you weren't of Northern European, then you were considered unworthy. And this sort of fed into the Nazi idea of the master race. That's why there was such an emphasis that these sort of Nordic-looking, you know, blonde, blue-eyed men were the ideal of the Nazi youth, even though none of the Nazi leaders were blonde and blue-eyed, okay? None of them themselves were of that tradition. And so there was a tendency in those days for there to be a racist and a Nazi association with the Norse paganry. Well, at the end of the Second World War, obviously that fell from favor. Nobody was willing to look at it that way. There has been, in the neo-Nazi movement, especially in the United States, there has been a return to some of that. They will use some of the Norse symbols as neo-Nazi symbols. They will, and they call that the folkish approach to Norse beliefs. Folkish means racial purity. It's a neo-Nazi kind of thing. Those who don't follow that, but still believe in, like an Asatru, they are called the universalist pagans. And they absolutely would insist that while they value the heritage from Scandinavia and Northern Europe, they are not racist. Anyone is welcome into their religion. They do not, you know, they absolutely renounce any affiliation between Nazism and what they believe, etc. So there are different approaches to this. You will see some of these symbols and people talking about neo-paganism as part of the neo-Nazi movement in the United States. These folks in Iceland completely reject that. They are going in a completely different direction. That doesn't mean I think they're right, but it's better than going the other way, all right? So these people, like the ancient Norse believers, are polytheistic. They have a whole pantheon of gods, Odin, Thor, Freyr, others. They are also animistic. They believe that there are spiritual beings within all of the elements of nature. And you hear this in the New Age movement or in like Native American religions, the spirit of the mountain, the spirit of the river, the spirit of the wolf. That there's a pantheistic or a panentheistic kind of approach. If you don't know what those words mean, come and talk to me later and I'll explain them to you. But the idea that there are spiritual beings that reside in natural objects, this too is a part of this kind of paganism. Again, this is based significantly on the Icelandic stories, the poetic Eddas, the prose Eddas, and the sagas from the 12th century and some in the 13th century. That's what they base this on. They also have a strong emphasis on some of the other historical writings that talked about, even Tacitus, the Latin historian writer, who wrote the Germania, which is a story of the Germanic peoples. He has a lot in there about the Norse religion, and so they really value that. They make an effort, those who are serious about this, make an effort to speak the Old Norse language. Now, fortunately for them, in Iceland, Icelandic is probably the closest to Old Norse of any of the languages. But they will try to read the old stories in the original language as part of their kind of spiritual discipline. They also are very strong in emphasizing the use of runes. Runes were the ancient Scandinavian writing. You will remember I told you that Odin hanged himself for 9 days on Yggdrasil, the great tree of life, in order to sacrifice himself to gain knowledge of the runes, which he then gave to people. The runes, the writing, and you actually can transliterate our letters into runes. I mean, you can write your name in runish language. We know enough about it to be able to read that. They believe that they're not only a way of writing, but that they have very important spiritual and ritualistic meaning. And so the runes are very important to them. Just one other sideline, slightly fewer Icelandic people today that follow Asatru also follow a religion called Zooism. It has nothing to do with animals in cages. Zooism, similarly, is an effort to return to the ancient religions of the Sumerian people, the first civilizations in Sumeria in the Middle East. And they worship the god An, the universal god, the earth god Ki, the forces of nature, and the thunder god wisdom Zu, and so they call themselves Zooism. I just throw that in there as a little piece of information. If you meet somebody and they say, well, I follow one of the new religions in Iceland, you go, well, are you Zooist? And they'll think you're really smart. They may not be, but they'll know what you're talking about, because like 0.87% of all people in Iceland follow the Zooistic religion now. So about the rituals, as I say, they do not sacrifice animals anymore. They don't believe in that. Some of the followers of, I mentioned this, I think it was on this trip, I talked about the Druidry, the modern neo-Druidic movement, that they're trying to recover the old Celtic Druidism. They actually insist that there was no human sacrifice in the Druid history. Well, every source we have, and we don't have a lot of sources, but what we have says there was. The same thing is true here. It's very clear that the ancient Norse religions did sacrifice animals and people to the gods. But this is something that some of the new followers of Asatru, the new Nordic pagans, they say, oh no, they never really did that. Well, that's kind of wishful thinking. You know, they're trying to rewrite the past because they're not comfortable with it. But they do not sacrifice animals. What they will do, there's two major rituals that they participate in as part of Asatru. One of them is called the Simbel. The Simbel is a drinking ritual. It's not a drinking game, it's a drinking ritual in which they will take a horn. It's usually done indoors. They will take a horn of mead. These horns are specially made, and you can, we don't have any here. I think you see that, okay? And also, if you can see it, this fellow's holding one. They will use a large horn. It has to be from a large, powerful animal like a bull, full-grown bull. And I saw a number of these little horns in shops, you know, like silver bases on them and stuff like that, and they were only about 6 inches long. No. This has to represent the power of a large animal like a bull. And this becomes their drinking horn that's used in the ritual of Simbel. The Simbel ritual, they fill it with mead, which is beer made from honey. It's fermented honey, not from grain or grape. And so they will use mead, which was a popular drink back in the Viking times, and they will pass it around from person to person. And each person will take a drink of it, and it is a toast and drink to the gods. And at that point, they will either give oaths of dedication, allegiance, or praise to the Norse gods. And in many cases, they will make what are called boasts. A boast, when you're drinking of the Simbel horn, is to say something you are going to do, particularly something you are going to do that has a religious or a moral or ethical kind of commitment. You are promising that you're going to accomplish something. That's why it's called a boast. And the thing is, they believe that any of these kinds of either oaths or boasts that are made when you are participating in this ceremony, that these are binding, that you are making an oath commitment to something that is binding. It's believed that these oaths and boasts becomes part of the collective destiny of all of those who are assembled there. And so they're not supposed to take this lightly. It's supposed to be a very important thing for them. The second kind of ceremony they do is called a blot. And originally this would have involved sacrifice. The word blot means blood in ancient Norse. Blod is German. You know, those languages are related. So the blot is another ritual that they perform outdoors, and they will do it around a fire. Similarly, they will have a horn full of mead. Originally it would have been blood. And they pass it around, and each person will pour some out while they are honoring the gods. At the end of the invocation of the gods and the honoring of the gods, they will then pour the liquid, which originally would have been blood, on the fire as a symbol of their commitment. And it's really a symbol of giving, being prepared to give their lives. Originally it was blood. They used mead, which is from honey, as a sign of an offering, a life offering to these gods. But they don't do human sacrifice anymore. The third kind of ritual that they sometimes participate in, but it's rare, is called a Sade or Seder. That is a kind of magical ceremony where they, kind of a shamanistic practice that involves the leaders of the faith going into kind of a trance-like state and giving oracles. The desire is for them to come in contact with, to be in conversation with the Norse gods and the spirits, and then to be able to give messages about destiny. You'll remember when I talked about the myths and legends of the North, there are 3 Nords, they're called. It's believed they're also Valkyrie, but their responsibility, they sit at the base of the cosmic tree Yggdrasil, and they weave together the various threads of human life. Well, when you make an oath, or you make a boast, or you participate in any of those kinds of rituals, you really are committing that these things should be woven into the destiny of yourself and the community. And then when one of the leaders, the priests of the Nordic religion, goes into this trance-like state of the Sade, they are asking the gods or the Norns to tell them what is our destiny, what is going to happen, in the hopes that they can bring messages back from that. And then finally, the fourth thing that they commonly do as part of this religion is they have life cycle rites. Whenever they have a birth, a coming of age, a wedding, a death, they will have ceremonies to acknowledge those passages. Now again, they believe in, as all of the pagan Nordic people did, they believe in eternal life. The Vikings thought they would come back if they died a noble death in battle with a weapon in their hand. They'd come back to the Hall of Valhalla and Odin's Hall, and they would continue to drink and feast and fight and womanize for all eternity. Well, similarly, these people, when they go through these life cycles, the idea is that there are various steps along, and that death is not the end of it, that people will return. They believe in reincarnation. So all of this is part of what their beliefs are, and they practice this. There are about 11,000 of the, actually, that's not right. There are almost 30,000 now. There was an earlier number I saw, and then I saw a revised one. Almost 30,000 people throughout Iceland and other places who participate in the belief in Asatru. And you'll notice I told you that the Blot religion is done around a fire, and they will pour the offering into the fire when they're done. This is the headquarters for that religion. And you can't read this, but this is a man and woman who are, because they do wedding ceremonies, going into a church that's called the Church of Thor. And we were on the Isle of Man, which has a lot of kind of pagan history as well. And one of the guides told us that 2 good friends of theirs are priests in the pagan religion on the Isle of Man, and they do wedding ceremonies at the Ring of Brodgar, or not Isle of Man, the Orkney Isles. That these friends of hers are pagan priest and priestess, and they perform wedding ceremonies for other pagans in the Ring of Brodgar, and that there'd been one there just a little while before. In fact, there were still some flowers when we were there, and she said that's probably from the wedding they just had here. So they have a lot of these sort of life cycle rituals as well. So paganism was very early on in Iceland. It is back, and it is the fastest growing of all the religions. Now, it's still very small, but among the religions in Iceland, and in some other parts of Scandinavia as well, it's among the fastest growing of all the religions. Now, the descriptions of it, they're getting ready to build this temple. As I've read some descriptions from some of the leaders, they insist that they don't really believe in the Norse gods in the way people used to. One fellow said, "We don't believe there's some great one-eyed god riding around on an 8-legged horse." And yet they invoke the name of Odin, or of Thor, or of Freyr, or these others in the various ceremonies they do. And so at a certain point, my sense is, how do you reconcile that you don't really believe in them, but you're invoking their name in various rituals? It's kind of strange. But that's one of the reasons it's interesting. Any questions about this? Questions about either the Norse religion, if you didn't hear about it the other day, or about paganism in Iceland? Nothing. You just want to get off the boat, don't you? All right, you're ready for Iceland. Good. Well, I have very much appreciated all of your attention. Let me put this up here, by the way, before I forget. This is where you will be able to find the videos and the PowerPoints of any of the talks you might have missed, as well as there's a lot of other stuff I've done on other cruises, as well as other lecture series I've done. And then my email address here, if you want to contact me, if you have trouble finding it or getting on, or any other question you have, then please let me know. By the way, in November, Carolyn and I will be back aboard the Star Legend, the sister ship to the Star Pride. For the third time, we're doing the trip called Wonders of Arabia. We leave Athens, you sail through the Suez Canal, and you visit Petra in Jordan, the stone city of Petra, the Mount Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula, St. Catherine's Monastery, one of the oldest, most important monasteries in the world. You go to Luxor, where you visit the Valley of the Kings, the temples of Luxor and Karnak, and you get to see little bitty King Tut lying there in his glass box. He doesn't have all the gold stuff on him now. And I felt bad for him because his little black feet were sticking out from under the blanket that they had covering him with. Anyway, and then you go down the whole length of the Red Sea. You come out and visit two places, Salalah and the Ziggy Peninsula in Oman, and then to Dubai. And so it's an 18-day trip. We've done it twice, and we're really looking forward to doing it a third time because of all these spectacular locations. We will then be on the next leg, which is Dubai to Singapore, where we'll visit several places in India, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Malaysia, and end up in Singapore. That's called Pearls of the Indian Ocean. We'd love to have some of you all aboard. By the way, they don't tell me to promote this. It's just I'll be lecturing on those trips. We would love to see you there. And then next year, we've tentatively committed we're going to be on some of the trips they're doing, again on the Star Legend, in China, South Korea, Japan, and then the trip back to Alaska, Seward, Alaska. That will be mid-March to mid-May. So I'd love for us to be able to see some of you all again. It's so nice when we see faces that we recognize, as we have. You all were on the Wonders of Arabia trip. Was it a good trip? Did you like that trip, Wonders of Arabia? Okay. So, hope to see you there, and thank you very much for being so attentive and visiting the lectures. Thank you, and have a great trip to Reykjavik.